You can follow intermittent fasting correctly. Hit your eating window every day, skip breakfast, feel the mental clarity that settles in by mid-morning, and still be accelerating the biological processes that age you fastest. Not because fasting is broken, because of 5 specific implementation errors that almost nobody talks about, and that quietly undo every benefit you think you are accumulating. By the end of this, I am giving you a 3-part correction I call the Noon Reset Defense, and I will tell you right now, it comes from a hard-earned place in my household, not from a marketing deck. Before the countdown, let me introduce you to the invisible villain in this story. It is called Advanced Glycation End Products. The abbreviation is AGs, which is genuinely one of the better accidental acronyms in all of biology, because that is exactly what they do. They age you. These are sticky, cross-linked molecules that form when sugars bind inappropriately to proteins and fats in your body. Picture the burnt crust on the inside of a pan that never gets properly cleaned. That residue does not dissolve on its own. It builds up layer by layer, and over time it alters the surface it coats. AGs work the same way at the cellular level. They accumulate in the walls of your arteries, making them stiff and inelastic. They cross-link the collagen in your skin, degrading it from the inside rather than the outside. They damage the filtering membranes of your kidneys. They accumulate in the lenses of your eyes, contributing to opacity. They attach to the proteins that line your blood vessels and scramble the communication signals that tell those vessels when to dilate and when to constrict. Here is the part that surprises most people. You do not only accumulate AGs from what you eat, though dietary AGs are real and relevant. You produce them internally, endogenously, whenever blood sugar spikes sharply and unpredictably. Glucose reacts with proteins and fats through a spontaneous chemical process called the Maillard reaction, the same reaction that browns bread or caramelizes an onion, happening inside your blood vessels. Every significant blood sugar spike is a caramelization event at the cellular scale, and the faster and higher that spike, the more AG molecules form in the aftermath. This is why the intermittent fasting community's near-exclusive focus on what fasting eliminates, the snacking, the constant low-level insulin stimulation, the chronic glucose noise, misses a critical part of the story. What matters equally is what breaks that fasting window, how fast it is broken, what the body encounters in those first minutes of feeding, and what the hormonal environment looks like before the first bite arrives. Every mistake on this countdown connects either to AG formation or to the cellular system that is supposed to be clearing them, and cannot because the conditions for it to work have been accidentally compromised. Your body runs on 2 biological shifts, and this image is the one I want you to hold throughout this entire conversation. During the first shift, call it the build shift, your cells are in growth and storage mode. Insulin is elevated, nutrients are being metabolized and routed. Proteins are being synthesized and repaired from the top down. A protein complex called mTOR, which functions as your body's construction foreman, is active and coordinating the work. During the second shift, the repair shift, the build crew clocks out. Insulin drops toward baseline. A process called autophagy takes over. Autophagy, which earned Yoshinori Osumi the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2016, is the cellular cleaning and recycling operation your body runs when it has the resources and the quiet to do so. It identifies damaged proteins, dysfunctional mitochondria, accumulated cellular debris, and early AG deposits, disassembles them for usable components, and disposes of what cannot be recycled. Autophagy is the biological reason the anti-aging argument for fasting exists at all. It is not a metaphor. It is a molecular process with identified enzymes, identified triggers, and documented health consequences when it fails to run adequately. The 5 mistakes I am about to walk through are, without exception, ways that people accidentally keep the build shift running far past its scheduled end, or ways they compromise the repair shift so severely that it cannot do meaningful work even during the hours it is supposed to be active. Let us start at number 5. Mistake number 5. You are breaking your fast with the wrong macronutrient arriving first, and the metabolic spike you create in those opening 15 minutes sets a tone that ripples through your entire eating window. Most people who practice intermittent fasting understand, at least loosely, that insulin control is the central objective. Keep insulin suppressed during the fast. Allow it to rise appropriately in response to food. Then let it return to baseline cleanly before the window closes. What most people have never been told is that the sequence in which macronutrients arrive in your digestive system after a fast dramatically changes the height, duration, and downstream consequences of that insulin response. This has been studied directly, and the effect size is not small. A 2015 paper published in Diabetes Care, conducted by researchers at Weill Cornell Medical College, showed that eating vegetables and protein before carbohydrates in the same meal reduced the post-meal glucose spike by approximately 73% compared to eating carbohydrates first. The same food, the same total quantity, different order, a 73% reduction in the glucose spike. Here is why. When you eat carbohydrates on a completely empty stomach, specifically after a 16 to 18-hour fast, your gut wall has been cleared of the mechanical barriers that normally slow absorption. There is no fiber matrix coating the intestinal surface from a previous meal. There is no fat slowing gastric emptying. There are no competing proteins occupying the digestive enzymes. Glucose molecules from those carbohydrates cross the intestinal wall rapidly and arrive in the bloodstream in a concentrated, fast-moving wave. Your pancreas reads the rate of rise as an emergency signal and responds in proportion to the perceived urgency, releasing more insulin faster than the same food would trigger if eaten alongside or after protein and fiber. The insulin overshoot is more likely. The reactive dip that follows, where blood sugar drops sharply in response to the insulin excess, is more pronounced, and that dip is what creates the urgent, hard-to-ignore hunger signal 2 hours later that feels physiological but is actually the consequence of a poorly sequenced meal rather than genuine caloric need. Every time this cycle runs, it generates what researchers call postprandial glycemic variability, the chaotic up and down blood sugar pattern that correlates directly with AEG formation and accelerated vascular aging. A study published in Diabetologia using continuous glucose monitoring data showed that it is not average blood sugar that most strongly predicts vascular damage in otherwise healthy individuals. It is the amplitude of the spikes, how high and how fast, not just how often. The correction is specific. Your first intake after a fast begins with 12 to 25 grams of protein from a whole food source, paired with something fibrous. This does two things simultaneously. The protein triggers release of a hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1 from your gut wall, which slows the rate at which your stomach empties into the small intestine and sends a moderating signal to the pancreas before carbohydrates even arrive. The fiber from vegetables or berries forms a physical matrix in the gut that further slows glucose absorption. When your carbohydrates do arrive, rice, fruit, whatever you are eating, the metabolic context has been completely reframed. The spike is blunted before it begins. This one sequence shift costs you nothing, requires no supplements, and directly reduces AG formation at the first meal of your window. Mistake number 4. You are eating in a window that begins in the late afternoon and ends well into the evening, and the intermittent fasting community has spent years telling you this is metabolically equivalent to a noon-centered window. That claim does not hold up against the circadian biology research, and the gap between what is claimed and what the data shows is significant enough that I want to spend real time here. This is the moment in this script where I need to be direct about what I consider a mainstream failure of the fasting conversation. The dominant messaging around intermittent fasting, which I broadly support, use myself, and have written about extensively, has framed the eating window as a neutral container. 8 hours of eating, 16 hours of fasting. Start it where you want. The math is the same. The biology will follow. This framing began collapsing seriously around 2018 when researchers at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, led by circadian biologist Thachen Panda, began publishing human trial data showing that the timing of the eating window relative to the body's internal clock is not biologically neutral. It is profoundly, mechanistically consequential. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2017 was awarded to three American scientists, Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young, for their work identifying the molecular mechanisms behind biological clocks. These clocks exist in virtually every organ in your body. Your liver has a clock. Your pancreas has a clock. Your intestinal cells have a clock. These clocks are synchronized to the light-dark cycle of the external environment, and they determine when each of those organs is metabolically primed for its primary function. Your liver's ability to process glucose efficiently peaks in the late morning and early afternoon. Insulin sensitivity. How readily your muscle and liver cells respond to insulin and pull glucose out of the blood is at its highest point in the first half of the day and measurably declines from late afternoon onward. Beta cell function, which is the technical term for how well your pancreatic cells secrete appropriately calibrated insulin in response to a meal, follows the same downward curve as the day progresses. A 2019 study published in Cell Metabolism by Sutton and colleagues tested early time-restricted eating, specifically a window running roughly from 7 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, against a standard 12-hour eating window in men with prediabetes. Both groups ate the same foods. Neither group was told to eat less. At the end of the trial, the early window group showed improved insulin sensitivity, lower fasting insulin, reduced blood pressure, and lower markers of oxidative stress. The control group showed none of these improvements. The metabolic benefit came entirely and specifically from the timing, not from weight loss because there was none, not from eating differently because they were not. Now consider what this means for the person eating from 2 in the afternoon to 10 at night. You are loading your digestive and metabolic system during the exact hours when its capacity to handle that load is declining. Your liver is moving toward its overnight processing mode. Your pancreatic insulin response is less precisely calibrated. The glucose from your dinner stays elevated in your bloodstream longer than the same dinner eaten at noon would because the machinery processing it is running at reduced efficiency. This prolonged elevated glucose is a direct driver of the AG formation cycle we discussed at the open, and the practical consequence is that the repair shift autophagy gets crowded out. If your last meal ends at 10 at night and you eat again at 2 in the afternoon the next day, your body is spending a portion of what should be deep autophagy time still managing the metabolic aftermath of a late evening meal consumed when your circadian biology least wanted it. None of this means you must eat breakfast at 7 in the morning. Circadian alignment does not require an early start. What it requires is a window that opens no later than noon and closes before the evening metabolic slowdown takes hold. Noon to 8 is categorically different from 2 to 10, not in duration, but in the biological readiness of the organs processing the food. Mistake number 3. You are significantly under-eating protein inside your eating window, and the muscle tissue you are gradually losing in the process is accelerating your biological age faster than the fasting is slowing it. Here are the numbers on muscle loss that most people have never been given in a context that makes them feel real. After the age of 50, the average adult loses between 1 and 2% of skeletal muscle mass per year, even with moderate activity. After 65, under conditions of inactivity or inadequate protein intake, that rate can exceed 3% annually. Skeletal muscle is not merely the tissue that allows you to lift things or climb stairs. It is your single largest metabolically active organ. It is responsible for approximately 80% of glucose disposal after a meal, meaning it is the primary site where blood sugar is pulled out of circulation and either burned for energy or stored as glycogen. When you lose muscle mass, you lose this disposal capacity. The same meal produces a meaningfully higher blood sugar spike in a person with reduced lean mass than in a person of identical weight with more muscle. This is the metabolic arithmetic that connects sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss, directly to glucose dysregulation, and from there directly to AG formation and accelerated vascular aging. A 2019 meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Nutrition, looking at data across multiple cohort studies, found that low muscle mass was independently associated with increased all-cause mortality in adults over 50, even after controlling for body weight, body fat percentage, and physical activity level. Low muscle mass was the independent variable. The mortality risk was its own signal. Here is the intermittent fasting trap that most guides never acknowledge. Compressing the eating window to 6 to 8 hours means you have fewer total meals in which to deliver your daily protein requirement. And the daily protein requirement for adults over 50 who are trying to preserve or build muscle is not the government's official recommended dietary allowance of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which was set as a floor to prevent deficiency in sedentary young adults and was never intended as a target for older adults managing muscle preservation. The relevant target, based on research from the University of Texas Medical Branch by protein metabolism researcher Douglas Patton Jones and colleagues, is 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed in doses large enough to trigger what is called the muscle protein synthesis response. That last phrase is the critical detail. Muscle protein synthesis, the process of actually repairing and building muscle fiber, is not triggered continuously across the day by small amounts of protein. It is triggered by a leucine threshold. Leucine is a specific amino acid found in high concentrations in animal proteins, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and it functions as a molecular sensor for a protein complex called mTOR. When circulating leucine rises above a certain concentration threshold, mTOR switches on the muscle repair signal. Below that threshold, the signal is weak or absent. The leucine dose required to robustly activate this signal corresponds to roughly 30 to 40 grams of complete protein per meal. 20 grams does not fully flip the switch. It partially activates the pathway. Muscle protein synthesis begins at low intensity, and then leucine levels fall before the work is complete. You have burned the fuel without finishing the job. If you are eating 2 meals in a 6-hour window, and distributing your protein as 20 grams at the first meal and 40 grams at the second, your second meal is the only one generating a complete muscle protein synthesis response. If your total intake is 90 grams per day, which sounds like a lot until you calculate it against body weight, but you are getting it in one well-dosed meal and one underdosed one, you are getting half the anabolic signaling events you could be getting. Over months and years, this is the mechanism by which otherwise diligent fasters lose meaningful muscle mass. Not from starving, from distribution errors. Mistake number 2. Chronic caloric restriction inside your eating window is elevating your cortisol levels, and cortisol at chronically elevated concentrations is one of the most well-documented biological aging accelerants in the research literature. It suppresses immune surveillance, degrades muscle tissue, promotes visceral fat accumulation, and critically, it directly inhibits the repair shift from running at full capacity. Let me be specific about what I mean by chronic caloric restriction inside a fasting protocol, because this is a particular and extremely common confusion. Intermittent fasting is a timing intervention. It defines when you eat and when you do not. It says nothing about eating dramatically below your body's caloric needs during the eating window. But because intermittent fasting reliably produces weight loss in most people, particularly in the early weeks, and because many people who adopt it are motivated by weight loss, the two goals frequently blur. The result is someone eating in a compressed window and also eating far below what their resting metabolic rate requires. A 500-calorie deficit compounded with a 16-hour fast. A total daily intake of 1,100 calories stretched across a 7-hour window. The person is not experiencing normal fasting physiology. They are in sustained caloric scarcity, and their hypothalamus knows it when the brain detects prolonged energy deficit, and it detects this through hormonal signals, not through conscious awareness. It activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a cascade that begins in the hypothalamus, passes through the pituitary gland, and ends at the adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys. The end product is elevated cortisol secretion. In short bursts, cortisol is adaptive. It mobilizes stored energy, sharpens cognitive focus, prepares the body for physical demands. But cortisol secreted continuously over weeks and months because the body believes it is under sustained nutritional threat, does several things simultaneously, all of them counterproductive. First, chronic cortisol is catabolic. It breaks down skeletal muscle to convert amino acids into glucose, which is your body's emergency backup fuel supply. This directly accelerates the sarcopenia we discussed in mistake number 3. You are fasting to preserve metabolic health and lose visceral fat, but the cortisol generated by undereating is consuming lean muscle to keep blood sugar stable, which reduces your glucose disposal capacity, which worsens insulin sensitivity, which promotes more AG formation. Second, chronic cortisol suppresses the function of natural killer cells, a type of immune cell that patrols your tissues specifically to identify and eliminate what cell biologists call senescent cells. Senescent cells are cells that have reached the end of their functional lifespan or accumulated sufficient DNA damage that they stop dividing. But rather than dying cleanly through programmed cell death, they enter a persistent limbo state. They stop contributing to tissue function, and they secrete a sustained stream of inflammatory proteins, interleukins, TNF alpha, matrix metalloproteinases, that damage the healthy cells surrounding them. Researchers call this the senescence-associated secretory phenotype, and it is one of the primary drivers of the age-related tissue dysfunction that shows up as chronic inflammation, impaired healing, arterial stiffening, and cognitive decline. A 2015 study published in Cell by researchers at the Mayo Clinic demonstrated that selectively eliminating senescent cells in aging mice extended median lifespan, delayed age-related physical decline, and reduced tumor formation. The clearance of these zombie cells is not a marginal effect, it is a central mechanism of aging biology. Your natural killer cells are part of the surveillance system that keeps senescent cell accumulation under control. When cortisol suppresses their activity, as it does when you are chronically undereating, senescent cell populations grow unchecked. The inflammatory output from those cells feeds directly into the inflammaging cascade. And inflammaging, as we are about to see in mistake number 1, is the condition that blocks the repair shift from running in the first place. Third, and this is the loop that closes the system, elevated cortisol directly promotes insulin secretion and glucose release from the liver. This is a survival mechanism designed to keep blood sugar elevated under stress. But in the context of a fasting protocol, it means your insulin never fully drops to the baseline level required for robust AMPK activation and autophagy induction. The repair shift tries to clock in, and the cortisol-maintained background insulin level keeps sending the build crew mixed signals. The transition between shifts is blurry and incomplete. Autophagy runs at partial capacity. The cleaning crew does some work, but the building never fully empties, and the damage accumulation continues faster than the repair. The practical correction is not about counting calories obsessively in the other direction. It is about setting a floor, a minimum intake rather than a maximum. For most women over 50 with moderate daily activity, that floor is around 1,600 to 1,700 calories of whole, minimally processed food. If you are consistently below it, if you are finishing your eating window still physically hungry, or if you are losing more than half a kilogram per week while doing no deliberate exercise, you are generating a cortisol response that is biologically working against every goal the fasting is designed to achieve. Before I get to mistake number 1, which is the one that changed my understanding of why intermittent fasting sometimes produces nothing at all despite perfect execution, I want to mention something. I had read about all of this long before I did anything useful with it. That is not humility. That is just the truth. I had the bookmarked studies. I had notes from papers my husband printed out. I had the highlighter marks and the margin scribbles, and I still could not turn it into a daily practice that actually held. Part of that was my own stubbornness about routines. Most of it was the gap between understanding the biology and having something structured enough that the biology happened automatically while I was just following the steps. My husband spent months building exactly that. He had, in the years after his health crisis, an aneurysm and dangerously elevated cholesterol that appeared with no warning and ended with a long-term medication regimen he has since worked to reduce under his doctor's supervision, become genuinely obsessive about what the research actually said versus what he had been told. He pulled from the Nobel Prize research on circadian biology, from the protein timing literature, from the autophagy science, and he put together a 30-day daily companion called the Noon Reset Protocol. 2 pages per day. 1 page explains the science behind what your body is doing that day. One page is a tracker, so you are never guessing whether you are actually executing. There are 4 phases built into the 30 days: adaptation, activation, optimization, and acceleration. Each phase shifts what you are doing incrementally so the biology compounds rather than plateaus. He also included 25 breakfast meal ideas with exact protein counts, because as you now understand, that first meal is where most people unintentionally create the problems they think they are solving. The whole thing takes under 5 minutes a day. You can find it through the link in the description for less than a restaurant meal. I will be honest with you, it sat near my desk for a while before I picked it up. I regret that. Once I actually used it, it removed every ambiguous decision I had been getting wrong by default. Back to mistake number 1. This is the mistake that most fasting content never reaches, because addressing it requires understanding a layer of biology beneath the autophagy conversation. Mistake number 1. You are attempting to run a cellular repair cycle inside a body that is already locked in a state of chronic low-grade inflammation, and that inflammation is actively blocking the molecular trigger that makes the repair shift possible. Worse, the metabolic stress generated by poorly executed fasting can amplify that inflammatory state rather than reduce it. Here is the molecular mechanism, and it is specific enough that I want to walk through it carefully. Autophagy, the cellular cleaning operation, does not switch on simply because you stop eating. It is triggered by a specific biochemical signal. When cellular energy drops during a fast, a molecule called AMP accumulates relative to ATP. This shift in the AMP to ATP ratio activates an enzyme called AMPK, AMP-activated protein kinase. AMPK is a master energy sensor, and when it is activated, it does 2 things. It switches on the autophagy program, and it suppresses mTOR, the build-shift foreman. This is the fundamental molecular transition between your 2 biological shifts. The fast causes energy status to shift. The shift activates AMPK. AMPK initiates the repair shift. Chronic inflammation disrupts this transition at the molecular level. Inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines, specifically TNF-alpha and interleukin-1 beta, which are produced in excess when your immune system is running in a chronic low-grade activation state, directly inhibit AMPK activity. Research published in the Journal of Biological Chemistry in 2010 demonstrated this suppression pathway with considerable specificity. When TNF-alpha is elevated, AMPK signaling is dampened. When AMPK signaling is dampened, the autophagy trigger is weak. This means you can fast for 18 or 20 hours. Your cellular energy status shifts correctly. Your insulin drops. The biological conditions for autophagy look correct from the outside. But the molecular instruction that should follow: AMPK activates, autophagy initiates at full capacity, arrives at a receptor that has been partially blocked by the inflammatory environment. The cleaning crew gets a distorted signal. It shows up late, works at reduced capacity, and processes a fraction of the debris that a clean cellular environment would allow it to clear. This is not a theoretical concern. Chronic low-grade inflammation in adults over 50 is not a rare condition. It is the dominant biological condition of aging in the modern industrialized context, and its prevalence is staggeringly under-acknowledged in mainstream health communication. The research community has a specific term for it: inflammaging. This portmanteau was coined and developed primarily by Claudio Franceschi, an Italian biogerontologist, and a 2020 paper he co-authored in Nature Reviews Immunology describes inflammaging as the primary biological driver of aging in industrialized populations, not one of several contributing factors. The primary one: what generates inflammaging? Multiple sources, most of them entirely modifiable, and most of them things that intermittent fasting alone does not address. Visceral fat, the metabolically active fat deposited in the abdomen and around the organs, continuously secretes pro-inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and resistin. This is not the fat you can pinch at your waist. This is the fat inside the abdominal cavity, wrapping around your liver and intestines, and it functions like a slow-release inflammatory generator running 24 hours a day. Sleep deprivation, even moderate chronic sleep restriction to 5 or 6 hours per night, measurably elevates C-reactive protein, which is a well-established systemic inflammation marker. A meta-analysis in Sleep in 2012 covering data from more than 200,000 participants, confirmed this relationship with statistical robustness. Gut dysbiosis, an imbalance in the microbial community living in your intestine, allows bacterial fragments called lipopolysaccharides to leak across the intestinal lining into the bloodstream. This process, called intestinal permeability or more colloquially leaky gut, triggers a sustained immune response that adds to the total inflammatory burden. And ultra-processed food consumption, the boxed, bagged, and bottled products that make up approximately 57% of the average American adult's caloric intake, according to data published in BMJ Open in 2019, independently predicts elevated inflammatory markers even after controlling for total caloric intake, body weight, and macronutrient composition. Here is where the cruelty of this mistake becomes clear. A large proportion of people who adopt intermittent fasting do not change what they eat. They change when they eat. They are still drinking diet sodas during the fasting hours, the artificial sweeteners in which have been shown in animal studies to alter gut microbiome composition and in human studies to paradoxically trigger insulin-like responses in some individuals. They are still loading their eating window with the refined carbohydrates, industrial seed oils, and ultra-processed snack foods they always ate. They are still sleeping 6 hours a night. Their visceral fat is still substantial and metabolically active. The inflammatory environment has not changed at all, and then they are baffled when the promised metabolic transformation does not materialize. The fasting is attempting to run the repair shift inside a building that has been left on fire. Autophagy is running, but it is running in a severely compromised context. It is clearing some debris, but the inflammaging fire is generating new cellular damage, new senescent cells, new oxidatively damaged proteins, new AG crosslinks, faster than the diminished cleaning crew can remove what accumulates. The net biological result is not repair, it is a slower rate of deterioration, which is better than nothing, but it is nowhere close to what the biology is capable of when the conditions are actually right. The AG Zawar invisible villain from the opening minutes sit at the intersection of every mistake on this list. AG formation is directly accelerated by blood sugar spikes, which mistake number 5 promotes by eating carbohydrates first. It is accelerated by late window glucose elevation, which mistake number 4 creates by misaligning the eating window with circadian biology. It is promoted by the muscle loss of mistake number 3, which reduces glucose disposal and keeps blood sugar elevated longer after meals. It is driven by cortisol-mediated glucose release from mistake number 2. And it is amplified by the inflammaging environment of mistake number 1, which both directly promotes AG formation through cytokine-induced insulin resistance and blocks the autophagy process that would otherwise be clearing AG deposits from tissues. AGs also do something deeply self-perpetuating. They bind to specific receptors on cell surfaces called RAGE, Receptor for Advanced Glycation End Products, another eerily apt acronym. When AGs bind to RAGE receptors, they trigger an inflammatory signaling cascade that produces more cytokines, more oxidative stress, more cellular damage. More inflammation means more insulin resistance. More insulin resistance means more blood glucose stays elevated longer after meals. More elevated blood glucose means more AG formation. The cycle accelerates, it does not plateau. Without specific intervention, it compounds, and this is why the biological age gap between a person with controlled glycemic variability and one with chronically chaotic glucose patterns widens faster with each passing year. But here is what this means practically, and this is where we shift from mechanism to agency. Every single loop in that cascade has an entry point, not all at once, not through a radical lifestyle reconstruction, through targeted, specific modifications to 5 behaviors that most fasting protocols never mention. 5 behaviors that you have now, for the first time, understood at the level of mechanism. This brings us to the noon reset defense. 3 components, all of them specific. The first component is the clean open. This is the protocol for how you break your fast, and it follows a precise sequence. Your first intake after the fasting period begins with 15 to 25 grams of protein from a whole food source, eggs, Greek yogurt with no added sweeteners, smoked salmon, cottage cheese, a small portion of leftover cooked meat, paired with non-starchy vegetables or a small serving of berries providing at least 3 to 5 grams of fiber. No refined grains, no fruit juice. No processed protein bars with maltodextrin or sugar as the second or third ingredient. This sequence, protein and fiber before carbohydrates, activates glucagon-like peptide 1 from your gut wall before glucose arrives, physically moderating the insulin response, and begins the eating window without generating the AG-forming glycemic spike that undermines everything the fast accomplished. The timing constraint is specific. This break-fast meal happens between 11:30 in the morning and 12:30 in the afternoon. Not because noon is a magic number, but because it positions the peak insulin sensitivity window of your circadian biology in the first 2 to 3 hours of your eating period, which is exactly where the research says it belongs. The one mistake that invalidates this component, using a flavored protein shake with any sugar content above 5 grams per serving as your first intake. Read the label. Many popular fasting community protein products are loading your first post-fast meal with 10 to 15 grams of sugar that you are not counting because the container says protein on the front. The second component is the anti-AG window. This governs the quality of your entire eating period and specifically targets the reduction of both dietary AG intake and the internal conditions that generate AGs endogenously. Practically, it involves 3 specific practices. Cook with moist heat as your default method, steaming, poaching, slow cooking in liquid, rather than high dry heat methods like grilling, broiling, or pan frying at high temperatures. This is not a minor preference. Research from Mount Sinai School of Medicine by Jaime Urdabari and colleagues, published in the Journal of the American Dietetic Association in 2010, measured the AG content of hundreds of common foods prepared by different methods. A dry grilled chicken breast contained approximately 4 to 5 times the dietary AG load of the same chicken breast poached. You consume those preformed dietary AGs, they add to your tissue AG burden, and they activate RAGE receptors with the same downstream inflammatory consequence as endogenously produced AGs. Second practice, keep your highest glycemic foods in the middle of your eating window rather than at the opening or close of it, where the buffer of previously consumed protein and fat can moderate their blood sugar impact. Third practice, include at least one documented anti-inflammatory anchor food each day, not in the vague superfood marketing sense, specifically wild-caught fatty fish or sardines for the omega-3 long-chain fatty acids that reduce interleukin-6 and CRP. Extra virgin olive oil, whose primary phenolic compound, oleocanthal, inhibits the same cyclooxygenase enzyme pathway targeted by ibuprofen. This was documented in research published in Nature in 2005 by Gary Beauchamp at the Monell Chemical Senses Center. And blueberries, which in a randomized controlled trial from the University of Cincinnati published in 2012, reduced interleukin-6 in overweight adults with cardiovascular risk factors. These are foods with documented specific anti-inflammatory mechanisms at realistic serving sizes. The common mistake that invalidates this component is treating the eating window as a metabolic reward for enduring the fast. The psychology of earned indulgence, I fasted all morning, I deserve this, is one of the most reliable mechanisms by which people undo every repair the fast created. The fast and the eating window are not opposites. They are both halves of the same two-shift biological system, and both have to run correctly for the mathematics of cellular repair to work in your favor. The third component is the cortisol cutoff. This addresses mistake number 2, and it works not through calorie tracking, but through a behavioral floor constraint. The rule is simple to state and harder to follow than it sounds. If you complete your eating window and you are still physically hungry, you ate too little. Your hunger signal after a well-structured fast with adequate protein is a reasonably calibrated indicator. Trust it, set a minimum, not a maximum. For most women over 50 with moderate daily movement, that minimum is around 1,600 to 1,700 calories per day of whole food eating inside the window. Below that floor, cortisol rises, muscle catabolism accelerates, natural killer cell surveillance of senescent cells is suppressed, and AMPK activation is blunted by background insulin elevation, all the mechanisms we have been through. The specific failure mode that invalidates this component is running the noon reset defense simultaneously with an aggressive caloric deficit. Two competing protocols. The fasting signal says run the repair shift. The caloric scarcity signal says stay in emergency mode, hold the build shift. The body cannot fully execute both instructions. The metabolic health goal and the rapid weight loss goal are not always compatible at the same time, and trying to force them to be simultaneously is one of the more reliable ways to spend months doing intermittent fasting and reporting that intermittent fasting does not work. One final thought on where all of this originates. Yoshinori Osumi discovered how cells eat themselves, how they recycle their own broken components, and won a Nobel Prize for it. Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young discovered that every organ in your body runs on an internal clock synchronized to light and won a Nobel Prize for it. These are not obscure findings. They are foundational discoveries about how the human body works, and both of them directly inform everything on this countdown. The question they raise is not whether fasting works, it is whether you are creating the conditions that allow it to work. The right timing, the right sequence, the right cellular environment, the right nutritional floor. The 5 mistakes are not 5 random errors. They are 5 ways of accidentally ignoring the Nobel-level biology that explains exactly why the fasting was supposed to help in the first place. If you are starting the noon reset defense this week, the clean open, the anti-AG window, the cortisol cutoff, comment clean open below. I want to see who is actually doing this, not just bookmarking it. And if this is your first time on this channel, subscribe. This is what we do here, not cheerleading, not supplement recommendations that earn commissions, the actual biology of how your body works after 50, from someone who has read an unreasonable number of clinical papers and remains mildly, persistently amused that this information is not considered common knowledge.